Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews number 7. On our way to 10.
Yeah, this is great. This is really great. I'm in a different shirt today. I have my new computer chair. We're good to go.
Deadly. Yeah, that's right.
I'm really excited about tonight. So this one kind of coincides. Today, we're recording this on the 6th of July. I know it will come out later in the month or whatever, but we're recording this the 6th of July. So the 4th of July, the date of America's independence, happened on Sunday. And I decided that to sort of coincide with the month of July, we would do reviews sort of related to American history or policy. So tonight we're going to be reviewing a sort of classic of American literature that I think still has an incredible amount of relevance and is important. And that is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which is something I actually never read until earlier this year. It was a book I never got to. I'd read things of Frederick Douglass's.
Right.
This edition that I have is very cool. It was published by Borders before Borders went out of business. I bought it at a Goodwill, and not only does it have the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which is his first autobiography. Frederick Douglass in his life wrote 3 autobiographies, and each one sort of catches you up to where he is now. So he wrote The Narrative of the Life, which came out, I think, in like 1845. And then he wrote a second autobiography called My Bondage and My Freedom, which I think takes you up through maybe like the 1860s or 70s. And then the last one, which is, I think, called The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which is like the final big one because he lived until into the early 1890s. So he lived a very long life, a very powerful and important life in the history of the United States.
Okay.
For those who are not aware, Frederick Douglass was a former enslaved person who fled being enslaved and eventually made his way to New England. He had considered going to Canada, but eventually made his way to New England. I think he did live in Canada for a while, but then came back.
Okay.
Founded a influential newspaper in the 19th century called the North Star, which you can actually read online through the Library of Congress.
Very cool.
It was very much molded on the model of William Lloyd Garrison, who was the abolitionist activist and publisher who published the legendary newspaper The Liberator. William Lloyd Garrison wrote the introduction to this book, the introduction to the Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass.
Okay.
And this edition comes with the narrative. It also comes with a fiction piece that Frederick Douglass wrote called The Heroic Slave, which by all accounts is the first published fictional slave narrative in the United States. And it was published in 1853. So that's like the first half of the book. And the second half of the book is a collection of essays and speeches that he gave throughout his life. And there's so many different ways to understand and read through the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass and to read his work. But we're going to focus on a couple things tonight because I think they go really hand in hand with the sort of guiding idea of this podcast, right? One of them is his critique of religion.
Okay.
So just up front, like Douglass was not an atheist. He was not.
We're not rewriting the history.
We're not rewriting history. And in fact, at the end of the narrative, he actually writes this extensive appendix, which is sort of a last chapter of the book where he lays out why he's not an atheist. He basically says, like, if you've read up to this point, you would have assumed that I hate religion or that I hate Christianity, and I don't. And so Frederick Douglass's spirituality and religion is very interesting. I mean, I would basically describe him, I think the best way to describe him is as a sort of small L liberal Christian.
Okay.
But I also think he had sort of like deistic influences. Clearly, he was influenced by the sort of intellectual currents of his time, which is the mid-19th century. So he's very much influenced by not just the Second Great Awakening in the United States, which is this massive religious revival that starts in sort of the 1830s, makes its way up through the 1840s and 50s. But he's also very much influenced by the sort of free-thinking elements that are around him. Particularly sort of, people like Robert Ingersoll, who I've written about extensively The Great Agnostic. If you've heard my previous podcast with Corey all about Ingersoll rather, Ingersoll and Frederick Douglass met. They had, I can't remember exactly when it was, maybe it would have had to have been in the 1860s or 70s, because it was in Peoria, Illinois when Ingersoll was living in Illinois. So it would have been before 1876 or something like that. But Frederick Douglass was coming in town. He was giving a lecture. He needed a place to stay, and he didn't have a place to stay. And Ingersoll said, "Hey, you can stay with me." And that was a big deal. Like in, 1860s, 1870s, Peoria, Illinois, where this wealthy white man let, an African-American former enslaved person stay at his house.
Right.
Like that was a big deal. Frederick Douglass also met Lincoln. He met President Lincoln. There's numerous books about their sort of acquaintance. But Frederick Douglass was sort of one of the consciences of American life in the 19th century, because his life is he covers most of the 19th century. And we can get into the better part of the narrative now. He was born somewhere between 1817 and 1818. He doesn't know his exact day. Okay. As many slaves did not, as many enslaved people didn't know. They didn't know their birthday. I think at some point he settled on Valentine's Day, 1817 as his birthday. Sure.
That's a good day.
He was born... He was born George Washington Augustus Bailey, and this first sentence of the narrative is, "I was born in Tuckahoe, near Hillsborough, and about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen my authentic record containing it. By far the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant." Mm. So he lives most of his life as an enslaved person in the state of Maryland. Almost all of it in the state of Maryland. And the narrative follows his life up until about 1845. Okay. And so he lives with the Auld family, and he talks about how this is how he learned to read. The wife of his master sort of provided him with the sort of basic tools to learn how to read. Okay. But then they realized how important it was to keep a slave ignorant, because that's a big theme of the book, is that, ignorance is the way in which the slave masters maintain control over slaves. Right. And so over time, he writes really painfully in the narrative about how this woman who had once been so warm and kind to him over time becomes an absolute monster. Yeesh. And it's to maintain this sort of power relationship, and becomes just as bad. Right. The other thing I think that's really crucial to understand too is that and this goes into one of the major themes we can talk about tonight, which is this idea of his critique of religion. So Douglass's view of religion is very much influenced by his time as an enslaved person. And one of the things that is, I think, a hallmark throughout his work is this real critique of what he saw as the religion of the Southern slave aristocracy. Right. That there were sort of two Christianities, right? There's in the 19th century, there's the Christianity of, say, like someone like a William Louis Garrison or a Ralph Waldo Emerson, this sort of, or a John Brown, which there's a whole speech that Douglass gave about John Brown, the legendary activist who raided Harper's Ferry, Virginia, a military garrison there with a bunch of freed slaves to try to lead a slave revolt. He was captured and executed for his actions. And in the American political culture, particularly on the left, and I think anybody on the political left sort of sees John Brown in very reverent tones. Right, yeah. And
the John Brown Gun Club and isn't that a one?
Yeah, John Brown's Body is a song that was sung a lot during the Civil War. Okay. But Douglass wrote a speech about him. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was another influential African-American intellectual at the turn of the 20th century, wrote an entire book on John Brown. And So there's that kind of that form of Christianity, which is very much influenced by the sort of what Cornel West, the philosopher, activist, and theologian, would call the prophetic fire. This idea that Christianity is the tool with which you activate and achieve social justice. You use Christianity as a means to do that. It's also called liberation theology.
Right. Yeah.
So that's I would say that's the tradition that Douglass sees himself in, is this idea of using spirituality as a means to achieve not just personal spiritual fulfillment, but also a sense of social justice. Right. So that's the version of Christianity that Douglass believes. But there's the other version of Christianity, which was the dominant form of Christianity in the United States during the slave era, and I would argue it still is today. I'm sorry, I have a hair on my face. It's like bothering me. Sorry about that. Sorry, you'll have to cut that out.
No worries.
So there's this other strain of Christianity in the United States, which is far more dominant, and I would argue still more dominant today, which is used as the sort of, as we've discussed on previous episodes, the phrase I like to use a lot is ideological architecture. It's the sort of ideological architecture upon which prejudice sits on. And he writes about that very, very poignantly and eloquently about his experiences. So in the middle of the narrative, I'm quoting from him, he says, "I assert most unhesitatingly that the religion of the South is a mere covering for the most horrid crimes, a justifier of the most appalling barbarity, a sanctifier of the most hateful frauds, and a dark shelter under which the darkest, foulest, grossest, and most infernal deeds of slaveholders find the strongest protection. Were I to be again reduced to the chains of slavery, next to that enslavement, I should regard being the slave of a religious master. I should regard being the slave of a religious master the greatest calamity that could befall me. For of all slaveholders with whom I have ever met, religious slaveholders are the worst." And in fact, this is very much true with arguably his worst master, his worst enslaver, which was a man named Mr. Covey. And a good chunk of the narrative takes place on this plantation that Mr. Covey owned. So for most of Frederick Douglass's life, his experience of being an enslaved person was bad. There's no version of being a happy or a
right.
Good, but his was much more. It was relatively better than some experiences. He basically, for a good chunk of his early teenage years and his early, sort of adolescence, he spent, his life as a enslaved person in sort of downtown Baltimore. This is where he learned how to read.
Okay.
And it's also the moment where he talks about when he's a young boy in Baltimore. It's the first time that he saw white people in real abject poverty. And he'd never seen that before. And that kind of influenced him. He went, wow, I didn't think white people lived in poverty, or I didn't think they would have this level of sort of, and he talked about giving them food and things like that. So they were sort of what they would call the sort of colloquialism as street urchins,
Right.
But his experience in slavery gets dramatically worse when he becomes, when he goes under the enslavement of Mr. Covey. Mr. Covey was an extremely religious man.
Right.
Before that, he was sort of a drunk and a sort of a brute. But he gets religion, and true to Douglass's form, he makes a point of saying that I thought for a minute him getting religion would make him better. It actually made him worse.
Right.
And so
he thought, think for a minute that he's gonna, maybe he'll buy into the treat fellow man kindness and all this love thy neighbor stuff, but instead it's the spare the rod crap.
Yeah, it's the you can beat the living hell out of your slave,
and as long as they get up in a day, then you're
good. Yeah, it's that kind of view of the Bible, right? And so he goes through this, he talks about how he loses pretty much his will to live. He's like, I've been reduced to a brute. He talks about how, Mr. Covey's main goal with me was to break me, and he achieved it.
And
got to a point where I didn't want to read. I didn't want to do anything. And he kind of has this sort of real turning point living in under Mr. Covey, where he gets in a fight with him. They argue about something. I forget exactly what it is, but they argue about something and it leads into a fight. And Frederick Douglass was told, hey, let's, by someone else, I'm going to give you a switch, basically like a little strap. And you can put that in your pocket, make sure you always have your switch with you. Well, then he proceeds to use that switch to beat the shit out of Mr. Covey.
Oh, geez.
Which is awesome. So there's this great scene in the book where he basically whips this guy's ass. And then he makes a point of saying, like, I was never whipped after that. Wow. And, basically he put that guy in his place.
It's fortunate that it went that way.
Yeah, right. Because he was pretty much, and because he was basically broken, he's like, look, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die. I don't care. And there's a certain level of, I don't know how to describe this, but there's a certain level of liberation in not caring anymore. Right. You when you're broken so much, it gets you to a place where you're sort of internally free, even if you're not externally free.
Yeah, the idea that you have nothing left to lose, sort of thing.
Yep. And so eventually he ends, because the way his contract with Mr. Covey worked was basically he was contracted out by his original his original masters. They contracted him out, I think, for like a year to live there, to do that work and then come back. So he's done with Mr. Covey. He then goes to another master who's not as bad, but still sucks, obviously. And at this point, he's like, I'm ready. Like, I'm ready to get free. I'm ready to be done. And he does it. He eventually escapes. What he does is he becomes sort of a day laborer, where he goes out, he's trusted with like tools and clothes, and he's trusted to go out, work a day, get a day's wage, bring it back to the master. And he builds up this sort of trust with his enslaver. Okay. And at some point he starts to like put money to the side, and then he's like, I'm going to put enough money aside and I'm going to figure out, and then I'm eventually going to go. And that's exactly what happens to him. Wow. And then he eventually ends up in, I think, the city of New Salem. And yeah, he says it's around 1838 where he really finally leaves. And no, not New Salem. He ends up in New Bedford. Okay. And so this is where he gets his name. So as I said to you earlier, his birth name was Frederick Washington Augustus Bailey was his name. And I'm trying to find, hold on, because it's a kind of a beautiful story. And yeah, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was the name he was given. The other little side point that's really important that I forgot when we started our discussion this evening is that, and this is actually an interesting point, which is important to understand, which is that some of the more influential and historically, I guess, understood or historically important figures within the sort of Black freedom struggle in America have been mixed race. Mm-hmm. And Frederick Douglass was no exception. His father was white and his mother was Black. And so you can kind of figure out where this was going. There were speculations as to whether or not his mother's slave master was his father. Of course. No one knows for sure, but that's something that's speculated upon and he never learned for sure. But Bailey was the name that he got from his mother. Okay. And so when he comes to the free world and he finally escapes being enslaved, he decides to give up the name Bailey and sort of create a new name for his life. And this is where his friend, a guy named Mr. Ruggles, says, "Hey, I've been reading this thing called The Lady of the Lake," and and in The Lady of the Lake, there's this person named Douglass with 2 S's. And, it's Mr. Johnson, who was a friend of Mr. Ruggles's. So this is what he says. When I got to New Bedford, I found it necessary again to change my name. The reason of this necessity was there were so many Johnsons in New Bedford, it was already quite difficult to distinguish between them. So originally he takes the name Frederick Johnson, then realizes, holy shit, there's a bunch of Johnsons. I should probably take a name that's more distinguished. Not distinguished, but more delineating. It's more unique. And so Mr. Johnson, he kept Frederick because he said he wanted to hold on to some sense of his identity, but he wanted to change his last name. And so Mr. Johnson had just been reading The Lady of the Lake and at once suggested that my name be Douglas. From that time until now, I have been called Frederick Douglass. And as I am more widely known by that name than by either of the others, I shall continue to use it as my own, which is what he used for the rest of his life. So that's how he gets his last name.
Okay.
And from there, he eventually makes his way. He was planning on being sort of a shipmate person, but then there were certain laws against it, and so he couldn't. So eventually he leaves New Bedford. And I do think he lives in Canada for time. And then eventually makes his way, I think Philadelphia or something like that. There's an excellent biography of Frederick Douglass I've not read, but I know it's very, very good, called Prophet of Freedom by David Blight. I have it on my shelf. It's one of those I've not gotten around to. It's an enormous book. But it's kind of like the definitive biography of Frederick Douglass. Okay. And written by a Douglass scholar. And so you can go into kind of like how his life moves. Because this book really doesn't give you a good sense of like where he, like biographically beyond what you read.
Right. It's more about what he's thinking when he's living, I guess.
Yeah. What he's yeah. And so that's pretty much the narrative in a nutshell. He goes through a lot of trials and tribulations. He talks about as a young boy being fed cornmeal from a trough. Like there's all kinds of really sort of horrible shit in it, but then he goes on, but then he constantly goes on to reiterate and tell you like, hey, what I'm telling you is bad, but it's only a fraction of what I've ever seen in my life and only a fraction of what I've ever personally experienced. So there's always worse, but it just gives you an insight into where he is. And then I wanted to spend a second talking about the appendix, which I talked about earlier, which is, so he spends a lot of the book criticizing Christianity as practiced by slaveholders, by the enslavers. So then he makes a point of sort of saying in the band, hey, I'm not anti-religious. Here's what I think. And so, he there's a really short quote that's pretty good where he said, the man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin during the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. It's very good. I mean, he's Douglass throughout his life is very, very good at underscoring the central contradiction of the American experiment, which is this idea that we are a country that's supposedly founded on liberty. And yet, when we were founded, there were millions of people who were enslaved. And in fact, the majority of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence and signed the Constitution were in fact slave owners.
Yeah.
And so he constantly hammers this point, which is that, you say that you believe in enlightenment, you say you believe in liberty, you say you believe in Christianity, but what you really believe in is using these as a cudgel by which you can keep people enslaved. And I think that's very telling. I think that's and there are other great writers who have hit on these contradictions later on. Obviously, W.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, Angela Davis, and recently Ibram Kendi. Stand from the beginning and how to be an anti-racist. There's a rich tradition of exposing and really underscoring this core contradiction. But I want to say, he basically says, this is a long phrase, but it gives you a sense of where he's at. He says, what I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason, but the most deceitful one, for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, the grossest of all libels. And so, I mean, it's a pretty indicting phrase. It's a pretty indicting passage, which I think is really important. And if you look at the people in the United States who are the most fucking pious, generally they are the ones who are the most corrupt.
Right up till today. Yeah.
And right up to today, they are the most corrupt, venal, immoral, disgusting people. Yeah. And so I think it's important, and that's not all people who are religious, but there's a version of Christianity in this country that goes back to the founding, which is like this. And I think the best way to explain it is the Christianity of the slave owner.
Right.
It's the Christianity of the enslaver. And, I think that applies to the sort of right-wing zealotry, zealous Christianity of the United States or Canada or whatever. It's the Christianity of the slaveholder, or it's the religion of the slaveholder. Yeah. And so, I think, it's really interesting because there's even a phrase, and I can't remember exactly. I don't think it's in the narrative. I actually think it's in another an essay that he wrote called "The Church and Prejudice."
Okay.
And no, it's not in The Church and Prejudice. It's great though. Let me see if I can find it. It's awesome because he basically says, at some point, he said, "I would rather be an atheist than be a Christian like these people." Right. And it's great. Like, let's see if I can find it. Hold on. But yeah, so that's kind of where, let's see. Here we go. This is actually from the most important speech that's in this collection, which is the meaning of July 4th for the Negro, or what to the slave is the 4th of July. It has a bunch of different titles, but this is a speech that he gives in 1852, where he's asked to talk about the 4th of July. And he basically says, do you mock me with asking me to talk about the 4th of July holiday that has no fucking meaning to me? But basically he says, for my part, I would say, welcome infidelity, welcome atheism, welcome anything in preference to the gospel as preached by those divines, meaning the slave owners. They convert the very name of religion into an engine of tyranny and barbarous cruelty, and serve to confirm more infidels in this age than all the infidel writings of Thomas Paine, Voltaire, and Bolingbroke put together have done. Now, for those who don't know, Thomas Paine was, arguably the greatest founding father because he wasn't a slave-owning piece of shit. And actually kind of practiced what he preached. He wrote Common Sense, which was one of the pamphlets that sort of kicked off the American Revolution. He wrote Rights of Man. And then he also wrote The Age of Reason, which is a criticism of Christianity because he was a deist. Voltaire, same thing, Enlightenment thinker from the 18th century, French thinker, wrote Candide. And then Bolingbroke, I think, is Robert Bolingbroke, who was an English radical. So he's kind of hitting all bases, but I think it's very telling that he's like, I would rather be an atheist than be a Christian like the slave owners. I think that's kind of cool. It's kind of cool to read that. And I imagine people, sort of middle-class white people hearing that in 1852 were probably like shocked to hear something like that. Right.
Yeah. That's a very extreme thing to say at that time for sure.
Yeah, but it's right. And so, and what I find fascinating is that he actually goes out of his way to say kind things about the founders. Like he's not like totally against them, like say we might be, but he tries to very much temper how he feels until he gets to this really great paragraph, which is probably the most influential one, which is that, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity are, to him, mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace the nation of savages. This is not a nation on the earth. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this hour. So it's like, yeah, I mean, he hits on it. It's damning in the sense that, like, again, it's that contradiction, which we still have to deal with today, which is that this country, the United States, was founded on settler colonialism and white supremacy. Yeah. Period. And he's hitting on it right there. But he's also, like, celebrating what the ideas of the revolution were good. You know, the ideas of liberty, the ideas of equality, the ideas of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech, all the liberties, which are supposed to be an important part of everyone's lives, are only really given to a certain segment of the population. Yeah. And to have a day to celebrate while you have millions in bondage is, as he says, it's but a joke. Yeah. You know? And it's I think it's pretty, it's pretty important to understand that he's not pulling punches. Right. And so it's kind of really compelling to read something from 1852, which is both extremely eloquent, but also very easy to understand. That's kind of the thing that's kind of beautiful of all of the best of American writing, whether it's Frederick Douglass or Thomas Paine or Robert Ingersoll, is that they wrote to be read out loud. So it's really fun to read out loud, and it's easy to understand when read aloud. Right. And so, he has a very unique, singular voice that's all his own. And it's both beautiful and fiery and prophetic and inspirational, and also very deeply harrowing and frightening because you realize what he had experienced.
That's awesome. I mean, what he experienced isn't awesome, but yeah, but it's awesome that he was able to write his narrative so that we could read it later on. Yeah, it's amazing,
and become one of the most sought after public speakers in his age. Right. And because I think he lived until 1892 or 95. So he lives well into the 1890s and writes and speaks well into the 1890s. One other side fact that's interesting is I think it's either his grandson or his great grandson became a world-renowned concert violinist.
Okay. That's interesting.
Which is kind of interesting, yeah. And I think there's like a picture of them together, but yes. But yeah, Frederick Douglass was someone, it's kind of, for lack of a better phrase, it's kind of American scripture. It's, you have the sort of secular saints of American life, and he's one of them. It's him, Thomas Paine, Lincoln, Emerson, Elizabeth, Lucretia Mott. Like these people are sort of, they're moral guides, and they're far ahead of their time. And so there's a bunch of other speeches in this book. There's one where he talks about, what is it? I think it's called "We Have Decided to Stay," which is his critique of, colonization. Oh, yeah. The idea of getting them out of the United States. And he basically says, I want to say to our white friends that we colored folks have had the subject under consideration and have decided to say, which gets laughter. Some of these speeches will give you like, here's where he got laughter, here's where he got applause.
Oh, okay.
Because a lot of times, the way that speeches were recorded in the 19th century, unless you had the original manuscript, the first, almost universally, the first way people would read these, if they were not there to hear them, were through newspapers. So a lot of the transcripts of speeches were in newspapers. And then what would happen later is that a small publishing house or whatever would then publish the speech in these little like 5-10 cent pamphlets. It was kind of the social media. It was sort of the Twitter of its day, where you would get, and Ingersoll was a part of this too. Douglass was a part of this. Mark Twain was a part of this, where you would sell 5-10 cent, newspapers, little pamphlets of like, here's my latest speech, and We Have Decided to Stay was one of them. And so, so he wrote that about colonization. He stood up for the voting rights, right after the Civil War. And so, and then he spoke well into the 1890s about, he wrote a great essay in here called The Color Line, which is all about sort of the ways in which prejudice continues, right, often through the guise of sort of inferiority or superiority. So he talks about that a lot. So, Frederick Douglass was one of those people who I'd always sort of, you hear about growing up, you see his picture, you hear about a little bit about his story. Once you actually read his words, I mean, there's, I don't know about you, but there's something about reading the words of somebody from that era, because the 19th century is my area of focus, right, historically. So reading Douglass was so cathartic because it was like you're witnessing history by reading his work. Right. And I feel really privileged and honored to have been able to read his work. And I think that's part of why I love the power of books. As Carl Sagan said, books are portable magic. And I think that's absolutely true. And so I highly recommend people, regardless of what edition you get, to check out Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. I also highly encourage people, if you're somebody who likes audiobooks and you have Spotify, there is an actual dramatic reading of the entire Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass.
That sounds awesome. That's definitely where I'm going to go for that.
which is performed by Academy Award-winning actor Forrest Whitaker.
Oh, nice.
And there's also, if you're also on Spotify, there's an excellent performance of What to the Slave is the 4th of July by amazing, legendary African-American actor Ossie Davis. His performance is absolutely incredible. It's as Cornel West calls it, it's the prophetic fire. It's just absolutely gorgeous and beautiful and powerful and just overwhelming. It's slightly abridged, the edition that he performed, but you get the gist of it. The stuff that's cut out, more of the boring stuff where he sort of provides historical context, but it's excellent. So you can listen to a lot of what I've talked about tonight on Spotify or YouTube. A lot of people have done dramatic performances of this stuff. Because like I said, Frederick Douglass, like many great writers of the 19th century, especially in America, wrote to be read aloud. And so I highly recommend checking it out on audio or getting it's one of those books you can pull up on Google and read right away. But it's, I think, to understand American slavery, to get somewhat of an understanding of it, as best as you can.
For sure.
His life and his work are an indispensable part of that learning.
Right on. That's... I got nothing to add. I will definitely be checking that out on Spotify though. Like I love a dramatic reenactment or reading with, so
I would have, the narrative that Forrest Whitaker performs is very good. He performs it more straightforward in his more sort of solemn style, but it's still very good. But the Ossie Davis one's incredible. I mean, there are some parts of it he's literally screaming it because it's great. Because back in the 19th century, people didn't have microphones. So you stood up on a podium and you had to yell. You had to project in order for people to hear you. So there are parts of like where he's like, "Do you mock me?" Like he's like really getting into it. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. The late, great Ossie Davis. These were recordings that were actually archived by the Smithsonian that he did. So yeah, I mean, Frederick Douglass was so cool in so many ways, and was, like I said, he was the conscience of a nation, and I think there's so much to learn from him, and to understand, and so so that's it. That's all I got.
No, sounds good. I guess the next step is, where can people find your content? And
Sure. So you can find me at justinclark.org. That's my website where I have not only my professional work, but I also have my sort of side work that I do. I'm working on a couple of projects right now. One that will probably be coming out later in the fall is an article I'll be writing for the Truth Seeker magazine about the friendship between Robert Ingersoll and Eugene V. Debs, the socialist labor leader, multiple presidential nominee on the Socialist Party ticket in the early 20th century. They were good friends. They were friends for 20 years almost. And there's so much of what Ingersoll was that is a part of who Debs was. And so I'm going to write about their friendship and the influence of Ingersoll on Debs. So that'll be one of the newer articles I'll have coming out. I also highly encourage people to follow me on Instagram. It's at Justin Clark PH for public history. My account's private now, but if you follow me, I'll check you out. Make sure you're not a bot. Or someone posing as a half-nude woman trying to get money out of me.
There's lots of those.
There's lots of those. Tell me about it. I get one of those every other day. Or somebody who wants to do fucking Forex trading. I barely know what that is. But.
We're looking for brand ambassadors for our marijuana, whatever.
Yeah. Get into the crypto market. It's like, no, right. Dude, I'm good. And then, so next time we will be discussing Richard Wolff's Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. We're going to be talking worker co-ops next time.
Nice.
And then I think after that, we'll be going back to American history a little bit. We'll be doing Nixonland by Rick Perlstein, which is all about the late 1960s, early 1970s, the Nixon era, and the sort of emergence of the divisions in American politics today. So that'll be an interesting one. We're doing Rick Wolff first because I've already finished that book, and the Rick Perlstein book is huge. I still need to finish it.
Okay.
Fair enough. And then later in the year, we're going to be doing some classic theory readings. We'll be talking Marx. We'll be talking Lenin. And if I can get the readings done, we'll also be talking Mao. So we're going to hit all of them. MLM, not at multi-level marketing, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. We're going to hit them all. And sort of talk about China. We're going to talk about the Soviet Union. We're going to try to get a sense of, what they call actually existing socialism, and just get a sense of what people historically, what was actually going on, so that, when some right-wing idiot tries to tell you how horrible the Soviet Union is, you have some kind of ammunition.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's all I got.
There's a lot of narratives that go around about the Soviet Union.
Yes, there are. And I think it's important to get, to not overstate your case in terms of talking about how great it is, but not also lying about it deliberately to make, somehow American capitalism look as if it has less blood in its hands when it certainly does not.
Right.
So, yeah. And we got a whole bunch of stuff coming down the pike. And I'm really looking forward to doing future ones.
Socialism, Scientific, and Utopian should be coming out right away.
Awesome. That'll be our first deep dive into sort of Marxist theory, I think. And then we're definitely going to do the Communist Manifesto later in the year. We're going to hit up some of the classic Marxist texts. We'll do Communist Manifesto, we'll do State and Revolution by Lenin, and we'll do On Practice and Contradiction by Mao. So we're going to kind of hit some of the key Marxist, Leninist, Maoist texts. And then as the future comes, we'll do other things, like we'll do like the Critique of Gotha program and Germanology and other shit. Whatever I sort of tickles my fancy.
Sounds good.
And we'll kind of go from there. So
perfect. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Corey.